The night air hung thick over Plainfield, Wisconsin, November 16, 1957, when Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden pushed open the creaking door of Bernice Worden's hardware store and stumbled into a scene that would haunt him until his dying breath. Blood pooled on the wooden floor like spilled wine, and hanging from the ceiling, suspended by rope and chains, was the headless, gutted carcass of what had once been a human being. The metallic stench of death, mixed with the acrid smell of fear-soaked wood and rusted tools, created an atmosphere so thick it seemed to cling to his uniform like fog. But this wasn't the beginning of this story. This was merely the moment when the world discovered what had been hidden in the shadows of rural Wisconsin for decades. What they didn't know was that someone had escaped Ed Gein's house of horrors months before this discovery. Someone who had done the unthinkable to survive, and whose miraculous resurrection from the dead had been carefully orchestrated by forces far more sinister than one madman's twisted fantasies. Before we continue, tell me in the comments from which country and city are you watching right now, and what time is it there? The official records state that Ed Gein claimed only 2 victims. The files, stamped and sealed in dusty government archives, speak of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden as the extent of his killing spree. These documents, typed on government letterhead and signed by men in suits who never set foot in Plainfield, became the foundation of a carefully constructed lie that would endure for decades, but buried beneath layers of bureaucratic silence, whispered in the corridors of the FBI field office in Milwaukee, filed away in classified cabinets that required security clearance to access. There exists another name, a name that was carefully erased from every report, every interview transcript, every piece of evidence that might have revealed the true scope of Gein's madness and the governmental complicity that enabled it. Her name was Margaret Thorne, a 23-year-old seamstress who disappeared from Plainfield on a fog-shrouded evening in March of 1957, 8 months before authorities would finally breach the walls of Gein's farmhouse and uncover his collection of human remains. The 1950s were a time of careful facades and buried truths, when America presented itself as the beacon of freedom while conducting some of the most disturbing psychological experiments in human history. The nation had emerged victorious from World War II, but beneath the suburban prosperity and nuclear family ideals, something darker was stirring in the corridors of power. Project MKUltra was already well underway by 1957, with CIA operatives conducting mind control experiments on unwitting subjects across the nation. From college campuses to mental hospitals to isolated farmhouses in rural Wisconsin, the Cold War paranoia had created an atmosphere where secrets were currency, where human beings could be reduced to test subjects, and where truth was whatever those in power decided it should be. In this climate of institutional deception, it became remarkably easy for certain stories to simply vanish, for certain witnesses to be quietly relocated, for certain survivors to be given new identities and sworn to eternal silence under threat of being declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized indefinitely. Margaret Thorne had been walking home from her evening shift at the local telephone exchange, her footsteps echoing on the empty sidewalks of downtown Plainfield, when her path crossed with Ed Gein's that March evening. The fog rolled in from Lake Winnebago, like a living thing, thick and gray and suffocating, swallowing the street lights and muffling sound until the world seemed wrapped in gray cotton that absorbed screams before they could travel far enough to be heard. The temperature had been dropping all day, and by evening the fog carried with it the bitter promise of a late winter storm. Gein had been driving his rusted Ford pickup truck, the same vehicle that would later carry Bernice Worden's body to his farmhouse, when he spotted Margaret walking alone along the deserted stretch of highway that connected Plainfield to the surrounding farms. What happened next would test the very limits of human survival instinct and psychological endurance, and would reveal connections between isolated madness and systematic governmental experimentation that authorities would spend decades trying to hide. According to a fragment of testimony recovered decades later from a sealed FBI file marked with classification levels that technically did unexist in 1957. Margaret remembered the sound of gravel crunching under truck tires as the vehicle slowed beside her. She remembered the pale face behind the windshield illuminated by the dim glow of the dashboard. Lights the nervous twitch of Gein's mouth as he offered her a ride in a voice that sounded almost feminine in its softness. The fog had grown so thick that she could barely see her own feet, and the temperature was dropping rapidly toward what the Weather Service would later record as one of the coldest March nights in Wisconsin history. Against every instinct that screamed danger, against the warnings her mother had given her about accepting rides from strangers, against the growing sense of unease that made her skin crawl, she accepted. The ride began in silence, but as they drove deeper into the countryside, away from the few scattered lights of Plainfield and into the vast darkness of rural Wisconsin farmland, Gein began to speak. His voice was soft, almost hypnotic, as he talked about his mother, about the farm, about the loneliness that ate at him like acid every day and every night. He spoke of conversations with his deceased mother, of the wisdom she continued to impart to him through dreams and visions, of the special purpose she had revealed to him in the months since her death. Margaret would later describe feeling as though she was trapped in a waking dream where nothing quite made sense, but everything felt inevitable, as if she was being carried along by currents too powerful to resist. When they turned onto the dirt road leading to the Gein farmhouse past the rusted mailbox and the broken fence posts that marked the boundary of his property, she finally understood with crystal clarity that she was going to die. The farmhouse loomed out of the fog like something from a fever dream, a Gothic nightmare of weathered wood and broken shutters that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Two stories of decay and neglect, surrounded by the skeletal remains of outbuildings that had long since succumbed to Wisconsin winters and the systematic deterioration that comes when maintenance is abandoned in favor of darker pursuits. Margaret could smell something wrong in the air, something that made her stomach turn and her skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. It was the smell of death, sweet and cloying like overripe fruit, mixed with the acrid stench of chemicals and preservatives, and something else she could unidentify, but which seemed to burrow into her nostrils and lodge there like a living thing. Years later, after decades of nightmares and therapy sessions that never quite managed to erase the memories, she would realize it was the smell of human leather being tanned and preserved, of flesh being transformed into furniture and decorative objects through techniques that Gein had learned from textbooks acquired through mail-order catalogs and refined through months of experimentation. Gein led her into the house, through the kitchen, his hand gentle but firm on her elbow, and Margaret's world transformed into a nightmare that defied all rational understanding and seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of human experience. The walls were decorated with human skulls, some polished to a dull sheen that reflected the weak light from overhead bulbs, others still bearing fragments of dried flesh and hair that clung to the bone like stubborn memories. Bowls made from the tops of human heads sat on rough wooden shelves filled with various objects that she could unidentify in the dim light, but which seemed to move slightly when she was looking directly at them. Chairs were upholstered with human skin, stretched and treated and sewn with careful precision that spoke of hours of patient work. Lampshades cast grotesque shadows through their covering of stretched and treated human flesh, creating patterns on the walls that seemed to writhe and dance in the flickering light. But it was the silence that terrified her most, more than the visual horrors or even the overwhelming stench of death and chemicals. The absolute, suffocating silence of a house where screams had long since been absorbed into the very walls, where the normal sounds of human habitation had been replaced by something far more sinister. He showed me around like it was a museum, like he was giving a guided tour to an honored guest, like he was proud of what he'd done and wanted to share it with someone who would appreciate the artistry and craftsmanship. He kept talking about his mother, about how she would have approved of his housekeeping, about how everything he had done was to honor her memory and fulfill the purpose she had revealed to him. The worst part wasn't the smell, or even seeing what he'd done to those poor people. The worst part was how normal he seemed in that moment, how gentle and almost childlike, like this was just his life, and he was sharing it with a guest who might finally understand him. Static interference for approximately 30 seconds. There were other voices that night. I heard them from the basement while he was showing me the upstairs rooms. Professional voices, educated, using words I didn't understand, but that sounded medical. They were discussing his work like it was a research project. End of transcript. Remaining content classified level 5. Margaret knew with absolute certainty, with the kind of primal understanding that bypasses rational thought and speaks directly to survival instincts, that if she screamed, if she ran, if she showed any sign of the horror that was consuming her from the inside out, like acid eating through her chest, she would become part of Gein's collection. The next morning, or perhaps the next week, her skin would be stretched across the frame of another chair. Her skull would join the collection on his shelves, and her disappearance would become another unsolved case that authorities would file away and forget. So she did something that would haunt her for the rest of her life, something that required a level of psychological control that most people never possess, even in their strongest moments. She pretended to be fascinated. She asked questions about his techniques, complimented his craftsmanship, even touched some of the grotesque furniture with what appeared to be genuine interest and admiration. For 3 hours, from midnight until nearly 3 in the morning, she played the role of an admiring audience to a madman's exhibition, all while calculating her chances of survival and formulating a plan that would require her to do something no human being should ever have to contemplate. The opportunity came near 3 in the morning, when Gein excused himself to attend to something in the basement, muttering about preparations that needed to be made and schedules that had to be maintained. Margaret could hear him moving around below, the sound of heavy objects being dragged across concrete, tools scraping against metal, and something that might have been humming, or perhaps conversation conducted in voices too low to make out clearly. She knew this was her only chance, but she also knew that simply running would never be enough. Gein knew where she lived, where she worked, who her family was. He had pumped her for information during their ride. Seemingly innocent questions about her background that she now realized had been a careful interrogation. He would find her, and when he did, her death would be slower and more creative than anything he had previously imagined. So Margaret Thorne made a decision that would echo through decades of official silence and bureaucratic cover-up, a decision that required her to embrace death in order to choose life. She staged her own death, using a kitchen knife from Gein's collection, a blade that had clearly been used for purposes she didn't want to contemplate. She cut herself carefully across the throat and wrists, following techniques she had learned during her wartime work at the munitions factory when industrial accidents were common and basic first aid was a matter of survival. She knew exactly how to create wounds that looked lethal but weren't, how to position the cuts to produce maximum blood flow while avoiding major arteries and veins. The pain was excruciating, a burning fire that seemed to consume her entire being, but she forced herself to remain conscious and controlled as she arranged herself on the kitchen floor, letting the blood pool around her head and shoulders in patterns that would convince even a careful observer that she had bled out. Then she controlled her breathing until it became so shallow as to be nearly undetectable, a technique she had learned from her grandmother, who had survived the 1918 flu pandemic by appearing dead when the burial teams made their rounds. When Gein returned from the basement 20 minutes later, climbing the wooden stairs with the slow, deliberate steps of a man carrying something heavy, he found what appeared to be a corpse in his kitchen. Margaret heard his sharp intake of breath, a sound that contained surprise and disappointment, and something that might have been genuine grief. He knelt beside her, and she felt his fingers checking for a pulse at her throat, his touch gentle and careful despite everything she had witnessed. His hands were warm and slightly damp, and she could smell soap and chemicals on his skin. For a terrifying moment that seemed to last hours, she thought he might detect the faint beating of her heart, but her makeshift wounds were bleeding freely enough to mask the vital signs he was checking for, and the pool of blood around her head had grown convincing enough to sell the deception. What happened next revealed something about Ed Gein's psychology that would never make it into any official analysis or psychiatric evaluation. Something that suggested his madness was more complex and possibly more controlled than anyone would ever acknowledge. Rather than being angry about losing his potential victim, rather than flying into the rage that might have been expected from someone who had been denied his prey, he seemed almost relieved. Margaret later theorized that some part of him, some buried fragment of conscience or humanity that had survived his mother's psychological abuse and whatever conditioning he had received from his mysterious visitors, was grateful that he wouldn't have to add another murder to his collection. He wrapped her carefully in an old blanket, treating her supposed corpse with a gentleness that was almost tender, and carried her to his truck, driving through the pre-dawn darkness with unusual care to avoid jarring her body as he transported her to a shallow grave he dug near the old Spiritland cemetery about 5 miles from his farm. But Margaret Thorne wasn't dead, and as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the thin soil that covered her, as the earth above began to warm with the rising sun, she began the most harrowing escape in criminal history. The dirt was loose and recently turned, and using fingernails that she broke to the quick and pieces of broken glass she found mixed in with the soil, she clawed her way to the surface like something from a gothic horror story. The process took hours, and by the time she emerged covered in blood and earth and her own bodily fluids, barely conscious from blood loss and exposure, she looked exactly like what anyone would expect a person to look like if they had actually died and been buried and somehow managed to return from the grave. She stumbled through the Wisconsin countryside for what felt like hours, but was probably much less, her sense of time distorted by trauma and blood loss. She avoided roads and stayed hidden in the tree lines, following fence posts and power lines toward what she hoped was civilization, leaving a trail of blood drops in the snow that would melt and disappear by midday. By the time she knocked on the door of a rural Dr. S. house in the outskirts of Waterloo, nearly 20 miles from Plainfield, she was barely conscious from blood loss and exposure, but she was alive, and she had a story that no one in authority wanted to hear. The doctor, a man named Samuel Rickert, who had been awakened by her pounding on his door, treated her wounds with the careful attention of someone who had seen plenty of trauma during his years of rural practice. But as he cleaned and stitched her self-inflicted wounds, as he listened to her account of what had happened with growing alarm, disbelief, he began to understand that he was dealing with something far more complex than a simple assault or attempted murder. When he attempted to contact the sheriff's department to report the incident, he was told in no uncertain terms by a desk sergeant who seemed unusually about this situation that no missing person report had been filed for any Margaret Thorne, and that his patient was most likely suffering from a mental breakdown brought on by trauma, possibly self-inflicted trauma, that indicated serious psychological problems requiring immediate psychiatric intervention. When Dr. Riker persisted, suggesting that authorities should at least investigate the farmhouse she described and verify her story before dismissing it as mental illness, he received a visit from two men in dark suits who identified themselves as federal agents and presented credentials that seemed authentic, but which he was not allowed to examine closely or copy. These men, who spoke with the calm authority of people accustomed to being obeyed without question, explained to Dr. Reichert that his patient was involved in matters of national security that were far beyond his clearance level or need to know. They suggested in terms that were polite but left no room for misunderstanding that his patriotic duty required him to forget everything he had seen and heard and to transfer his patient to their custody for specialized treatment that would ensure her recovery and protect sensitive government operations. If you're still here, it means you're one of the few who question the official story. Subscribe before this video vanishes. Subject Mount has been debriefed and relocated under witness protection protocols established under National Security Act provisions. All local medical records are to be confiscated and sealed under classification levels requiring director authorization for access. Dr. Samuel Reichert has been briefed on national security implications and has agreed to full cooperation in exchange for certain considerations regarding his son's pending draft status. Investigation of Ed Gein is to proceed according to existing timeline established by Project Redacted. No deviation from established parameters without express written authorization from Washington. What Margaret Thorne had stumbled into was not just the lair of a serial killer, but the outer edges of a psychological research project that had been monitoring Ed Gein for months, possibly years. Researchers working under the auspices of MKUltra and related classified programs had identified Gein as a perfect subject for studying extreme psychological deviance in controlled conditions, a living laboratory for exploring the outer boundaries of human behavior and the techniques that could be used to shape and direct that behavior. His isolated location, his obvious mental illness, his complete social alienation, and his history of maternal psychological abuse made him an ideal candidate for observation and manipulation without interference from outside authorities or concerned citizens. Margaret's survival and escape threatened to expose not just Gein's crimes, but the fact that federal authorities had been aware of his activities and had chosen to allow them to continue for research purposes that were deemed more important than the lives of his potential victims. Within 72 hours of her escape, Margaret Thorne ceased to exist as a legal entity, as a person with a social security number and employment records and connections to the normal world of human society. Her employment records at the telephone exchange were altered to show that she had quit her job without notice and had moved to California to care for a sick relative. Her landlord was told that she had found work in Los Angeles and would not be returning, and he was compensated generously for any inconvenience and for his agreement to dispose of her personal belongings without asking questions. Her few personal belongings were packed and shipped to an address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service. That led to another forwarding service and eventually to a post office box that was registered to a name that did not exist. Friends and acquaintances were told that she had suffered a nervous breakdown brought on by family problems and had been institutionalized for her own safety at a private facility that did not allow visitors or correspondence. The woman who had been Margaret Thorne was given a new identity constructed with the same attention to detail that the federal government used for deep cover intelligence operatives and was relocated to a small town in Oregon where she was provided with a modest pension, a carefully constructed background history, and a cover story about being a war widow recovering from trauma suffered during her husband's service in Korea. The documents establishing her new identity were backdated and inserted into official records with a kind of bureaucratic precision that suggested this was not the first time such an operation had been conducted. She was assigned a federal caseworker who visited her monthly, ostensibly to check on her mental health and ensure her successful integration into her new community, but actually to ensure her continued silence about what she had witnessed in Ed Gein's house of horrors and to monitor her psychological state for signs that she might be considering breaking her imposed vow of silence. For decades she lived under this imposed identity in a kind of existential limbo, never able to tell her story, never able to warn others about what she had survived, never able to contact her family or friends from her previous life. The federal agent who had orchestrated her disappearance had made it clear that any attempt to resume her former identity or contact people from her past would result in her being declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized indefinitely in a federal facility where she would receive treatment designed to help her recover from her delusions about government conspiracies and serial killers. The threat was delivered with the calm professionalism of people who had made similar threats before and had the authority and resources to carry them out. But the federal agents who had orchestrated her disappearance made one critical mistake that would eventually unravel their carefully constructed. They had assumed that a traumatized young woman would remain silent indefinitely, that fear and isolation would keep her compliant and prevent her from taking any action that might expose their operations. They had not anticipated that Margaret Thorne possessed the same iron will and calculating intelligence that had enabled her to survive Ed Gein in the first place, and that 40 years of imposed silence would only strengthen her resolve to ensure that the truth would eventually be revealed. Over the years, living under the name Elizabeth Morrison in the quiet Oregon town where she had been relocated, she began to secretly document her experience, writing detailed accounts of everything she had witnessed and hiding them in safety deposit boxes across the Pacific Northwest. She used different banks, different names, and different methods of payment to ensure that the paper trail would be difficult to follow and impossible to erase completely. She photographed documents that had been given to her during her debriefing sessions, documents that her handlers probably assumed she had been too traumatized to remember or understand. She recorded conversations with her federal caseworker using equipment she purchased through mail-order catalogs and assembled herself, creating an audio record of threats and admissions that would later provide crucial evidence of the conspiracy that had erased her from official existence. The truth about Margaret Thorne's survival began to emerge in the early 1990s, when a box of documents was discovered in the effects of Elizabeth Morrison, who had died in a nursing home in Bend, Oregon, at the age of 50. Morrison had left specific instructions that upon her death, the contents of several safety deposit boxes located in Oregon, Washington, and California should be delivered to investigative journalists, civil rights organizations, and university research. The documents contained detailed accounts of her experience with Ed Gein, along with copies of federal communications, psychiatric evaluations, and photographs that had never been made public, and which revealed the true scope of governmental involvement in monitoring and facilitating his crimes. Among the most damning evidence was a series of letters between officials at the Menninger Foundation in Kansas and researchers affiliated with MKUltra and related programs, discussing the psychological profile of Ed Gein and the scientific value of studying his behavior in his natural environment, rather than interrupting his activities with arrest and institutionalization. The correspondence revealed that federal authorities had been aware of Gein's grave robbing activities, 1954, 3 years before his arrest, and had made a deliberate decision to allow his crimes to continue and escalate in order to gather data on extreme antisocial behavior, the psychological mechanisms that enable such behavior, and the techniques that might be used to identify and control similar individuals in the future. Psychiatric evaluation, Menninger Foundation. Subject E.G. Date June 1956. Subject demonstrates textbook symptoms of severe psychosis combined with highly organized thinking patterns that suggests potential applications for intelligence operations requiring individuals capable of extreme actions without conventional moral constraints. Recommend continued observation in natural environment to document progression of behavioral deterioration and effectiveness of various conditioning techniques. Subjects geographic isolation and complete social alienation. Ensure minimal risk of exposure or interference with research objectives. Regular contact with research teams should continue under cover of routine agricultural extension visits. Stamped, classified, Project Artichoke Eyes only. The documents also revealed the existence of a network of similar cases across the United States, where federal authorities had identified potentially dangerous individuals with histories of psychological trauma and social isolation, and had chosen to study them rather than intervene or seek treatment for them. Margaret Thorne's case was not unique. It was part of a systematic program of psychological research that treated American citizens as unwitting test subjects in experiments designed to understand the outer limits of human behavior, the mechanisms that could trigger extreme violence, and the techniques that could be used to shape and control such behavior for intelligence and military purposes. But perhaps the most chilling revelation in Margaret Thorne's hidden documents was her detailed account of what she had seen and heard in Ed Gein's basement during those terrifying hours in March 1957. Details that had never been included in any official report or psychiatric evaluation. According to her testimony, Gein had not been working alone in his grotesque experiments. She described hearing at least 2 other voices during her time in the house. Voices that belonged to visitors who seemed familiar with Gein's activities and who discussed his work with the clinical detachment of researchers examining laboratory specimens. These visitors, he wrote, spoke with educated accents and used medical and psychological terminology when examining Gein's collections and discussing his techniques. The implication was staggering and would rewrite the entire understanding of the Ed Gein case if it were ever officially acknowledged. Ed Gein, the isolated madman of rural Wisconsin, had been hosting federal research, studying his methods, and possibly even encouraging his activities as part of a larger research program into the psychology of extreme violence. The narrative of the lone psychopath so carefully constructed in the media coverage of his eventual arrest and trial was a fiction designed to hide the true scope of governmental complicity in his crimes and the systematic study of his behavior by researchers who viewed his victims as acceptable casualties in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. Margaret Thorne's documents also contained detailed floor plans of the Gein farmhouse, including areas that were never mentioned in any official police reports and which seemed to have been systematically excluded from the crime scene investigation. According to her account, there was a hidden room in the basement, accessible through a concealed door behind a bookshelf that contained sophisticated recording equipment, filing cabinets full of documentation, and what appeared to be a complete photographic record of Gein's activities, stretching back several years. This room, she claimed, was cleaned out by federal agents several hours before local police were allowed to search the property following Gein's arrest, ensuring that no evidence of governmental involvement would ever be discovered through normal investigative procedures. Some stories were never meant to be told, But now that you've heard it, there's no way to unhear it. Share this before it's taken down, because some truths only survive when they're spoken.